Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the murky, cobbled streets of 18th century Paris, a place where your nose works harder than your feet. The air presses in, thick with the scents of fish left too long in the sun, butcher scraps abandoned on corners, and chamber pots upended without warning from second-story windows. There's no escaping it, you're in it now. A simple stroll could double as an olfactory obstacle course. And spoiler, you probably won't survive this without gagging at least once. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love it if you dropped your location and local time in the comments, too. It's always fun to see where, and when, you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward, pulling your coat tight against the damp air, but no amount of wool can block the smells. Imagine the city divided not by neighborhoods but by shifting clouds of odor. Your nose twitches before your eyes catch sight of anything notable. It's a map drawn by scent, one the locals carry in their heads. Paris at this time isn't the grand, polished city you picture today. It's smaller, more tangled, and wildly unhygienic. Historians still argue whether the notorious filth was more a consequence of poor city planning or just a general disdain for personal cleanliness. Either way, the result is the same, a city that attacks you first through your nostrils. The streets teem with life, fishmongers shouting over piles of questionable seafood, horses clopping through muck, vendors hawking everything from used shoes to dubious pies. But it's the smells that truly map your journey. A turn to the left might bring the reek of tanneries, or right, the sweet staleness of a bakery trying to mask yesterday's burnt loaves. Forget Google Maps, your best guide is a good sense of smell and a quick stomach. It's said that in those days, you could track your progress across the city without opening your eyes. The scent of horse manure and hay gave way to the sharper tang of iron and blood near the butchers. Further along, a nose-wrinkling sourness signaled you were nearing the dye works, where vats of boiling chemicals steamed up the streets. And if you made it to a pastry shop, that was your reward, if they hadn't burned the batch. No surprise, then, that perfume became less a luxury and more a desperate defense mechanism. More on that soon. The everyday reality for a Parisian involved battling a cacophony of stenches layered one atop the other like a noxious cake. Raw sewage sloshed along gutters. Trash was rarely, if ever, collected. People dumped waste out of windows with little more than a shout of "Garde à l'eau." Meaning, ironically, watch out for water. As a polite warning, if you weren't quick on your feet or alert to the shouts, you risked being christened with far worse than rain. Open scholarly debate continues about just how intolerable it really was. Some accounts make 18th century Paris sound like a festering nightmare, others insist that locals, desensitized by years of olfactory assault, hardly noticed anymore. Modern historians have tried to reconstruct these old scents in labs, bottling the pungent memory of a city before sewers. The results are, predictably, horrifying. And yet, for all its repulsiveness, this aroma tapestry was how you knew you were home. Different districts had different notes, a perfume only locals could appreciate, or at least endure. You pause on a bridge over the Seine. The river flows sluggishly beneath you, carrying along floating debris and the unmistakable stench of rot. The city sighs around you in 100 different smells. And you, brave traveler, take another step forward, nose twitching, stomach clenching, ready to follow this invisible map wherever it leads. You trudge on, already aware that in 18th century Paris, your nose is as crucial as your feet for finding your way. It's not just that each district smells different, it's that people count on those smells to orient themselves. In a city where street signs were often missing or useless and addresses were more of a polite suggestion, scent was the invisible hand guiding you. Imagine you're trying to meet a friend. There's no texting for directions, no pin-dropped location to share. Instead, it's, meet me 2 streets past the tannery stench, near where the bread doesn't smell burned. Practical, if a bit nauseating. You turn your face to the breeze, trying to sniff out your bearings, and sure enough, the mingled odors of fish, sweat, and stale ale tell you you're nearing the market district. Historians still argue whether the so-called smell map was a formal thing. Some scholars claim maps were drawn with scent annotations, others think it was purely in people's heads, a subconscious guide more reliable than memory. Either way, if you grew up in Paris, you learned to recognize places by their signature stinks, the way some people today know they're nearing a subway station by the distinct whiff of metal and burnt rubber. And it wasn't just the big landmarks that had a smell signature. Even small streets had their scent identity. One lane might smell of baking bread and wax from candlemakers, another, sour milk and coal smoke. A third might betray its hidden taverns with the overpowering aroma of spilled beer and damp straw. This accidental smell coating meant that getting lost was nearly impossible, unless, of course, you had a cold. Then you were doomed. You'd stumble around helplessly, missing the telltale stink of your destination and ending up somewhere very wrong, like the slaughterhouse district, where even the most seasoned nose recoiled. It's not like anyone enjoyed it. Letters and diaries from the time are sprinkled with complaints. One weary visitor wrote that Paris offends every sense but chiefly the nose, which is assaulted at each turn. Another recorded how he used to hold a perfumed handkerchief to his face constantly, lest he faint dead away mid-stroll. And oh, the handkerchiefs. If you were of means, you didn't just carry one, you carried it drenched in your best scent. Sometimes it was lavender, sometimes rosewater, sometimes something far heavier, designed to smother, not sweeten. A quick press to the face and voila, you could brave another few minutes in the wild stinkscape. Think of it as the 18th century version of noise-canceling headphones but for your nostrils. There were even city legends about people who supposedly had no sense of smell and thus were considered almost superhuman. Historians still debate whether these legends were just wishful thinking or rooted in rare medical conditions like congenital anosmia. Either way, if you were one of these odor-blind unicorns, you had a distinct survival advantage. Walking the city like this required skill. You'd have to know how to time your steps to avoid puddles that weren't rainwater. You learned to squint, not to see better but to brace yourself against unexpected gusts carrying even more unexpected fragrances. You perfected the fine art of breathing shallowly through your mouth, not too deep, lest you taste the air, but just enough to survive. It's a strangely modern thought, isn't it? This idea that cities have layers invisible to the eye but clear to the nose. Today we talk about the vibe of a neighborhood. Back then, the vibe was literally in the air, thick and clinging to your clothes. And you, stumbling bravely forward, are about to discover the first major landmark on this nasal map, the sprawling market district. If you think grocery store fish sections smell a bit off, well, tighten your scarf. This is a whole different level. But first, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity of those who lived like this daily. Navigating by smell might sound revolting, but it's also a testament to human adaptability. After all, when life gives you sewage, you learn to sniff your way through it. You shuffle onward, nose already battle-weary, and soon a new scent rides the breeze, thick, ripe, and utterly unavoidable. Welcome to the market district. Here, in the labyrinth of stalls and barrels, the air is a riot of smells, none of them good and all of them loud. The first thing to hit you is the cabbage. Not the crisp, fresh crunch you might imagine from a well-kept garden, but cabbage that has seen better days. Days ago. It rots gently in the sun, releasing a sour, sulphurous perfume that clings to your clothes, your hair, your very soul. Mixed into the cabbage cloud is the sharper bite of onions, the almost metallic sting of old fish, and the sweet, sickly tang of overripe fruits slowly liquefying in their baskets. You gag a little, it's almost a rite of passage, and press on. The market is the beating heart of the city, and if you lived here, this stench was your morning coffee. Historians still argue whether the market's particular odor was worse in the summer heat or during the damp of spring, but most agree it was consistently horrifying. Vendors shout over the din, hawking everything from bruised apples to questionable eels. Some try to mask the offensive air with aromatic herbs. Bundles of rosemary and thyme dangle from stalls like primitive air fresheners, but it's like throwing a bouquet at a burning landfill. The effect is negligible at best. You sidestep a puddle of something unidentifiable and nearly collide with a fishmonger slapping a suspiciously shiny herring onto a slab of wood. He waves it under a customer's nose as if daring them to say no. You catch a whiff and immediately regret every life choice that brought you to this point. What's remarkable, though, is that for the locals, this was normal. Familiar. Comforting, even. Just as modern city dwellers might not notice the rumble of traffic or the glow of neon lights, Parisians of the 18th century barely flinched at the constant nasal assault. The market district had its signature stink, and you knew it as well as you knew the sound of your own name. Among the more colorful anecdotes from this period is the story of the cabbage girls, vendors who sold heaping baskets of cabbages and other vegetables door to door. Their route was so reliably pungent that people joked you could set your clock by their passing. If the breeze brought the earthy, sour smell of wilted greens to your window, it was probably around 10 in the morning. Modern attempts to reconstruct these odors have been, let's say, ill-advised. A few intrepid historians and scent chemists have tried to capture the market's smell in controlled settings. The results have ranged from enlightening to traumatizing. One noted that the recreated scent had an immediate and profound impact on his will to live. As you weave through the chaos, You can't help but notice the market's unintended hierarchy of smells. The upper levels of odor are dominated by produce and herbs, but closer to the ground, where waste accumulates, you get the more sinister undertones, mildew, sewage, and the faint, ever-present whisper of decay. And yet, tucked away in corners are occasional olfactory reprieves, a baker pulling dark, crackling loaves from a wood-fired oven, a spice merchant with fragrant cloves and cinnamon sticks, their aroma struggling valiantly against the tide. These moments are brief but precious, tiny islands in a sea of foulness. Historians still debate whether the heavy use of spices in French cooking at the time was a direct response to the market's condition. Some argue it was purely culinary evolution, others whisper that it was born out of sheer, desperate necessity. You finally make it through the market, lungs aching, senses bruised. Behind you, the smells churn and swirl, an invisible storm cloud over the district. Ahead lies a promise of something slightly more bearable, or at least, a new brand of awful. Still, give yourself credit. You survived the cabbage cloud. And trust me, it's not going to get much better from here. You stagger onward, feeling slightly victorious but still very much under siege. Before you can recover, a new barrage of scent hits you, sweet, musky, almost cloying. It's perfume. Thick clouds of it, rising from powdered wigs and silk handkerchiefs, from corsets and cravats, from every inch of the wealthy elite who haunt the broader boulevards. Here in 18th century Paris, perfume isn't a fashion statement, it's a survival tactic. You sniff and nearly choke on the floral, spicy, and sometimes aggressively musky layers wafting off passing nobles. It's so dense it could practically be sliced and served with cheese. Historians still argue whether the French passion for perfume in this era was born from genuine love of fragrance or sheer desperation to cover the omnipresent stench of the city. Spoiler, it's probably a bit of both. Smelling nice was a social necessity, a way to assert your distance from the squalor of the lower classes. But more importantly, it kept you from passing out. You edge around a couple strutting arm in arm, their combined perfume creating a cloud of bergamot, ambergris, and jasmine thick enough to make your eyes water. She carries a fan, he a perfumed handkerchief, both wielded like weapons against the assault of reality. But don't get too envious. The perfumed aristocracy wasn't necessarily cleaner, bathing was rare, and many simply doused themselves in scent rather than deal with soap and water. One popular myth, which historians still love to argue about, claims that some nobles could go years without a proper bath, layering scent upon scent until their clothes practically fermented. Perfume recipes back then were elaborate, requiring exotic ingredients imported at great cost, myrrh from Arabia, civet from Ethiopia, and, for the truly daring, a dash of crushed ambergris, a waxy substance from the intestines of sperm whales, prized for its fixative properties. Romantic, right? The perfumers of Paris were celebrated figures, crafting bespoke blends for the wealthy, though let's be honest, the bar was low, anything smelled better than the streets. These fragrances weren't subtle either. They were designed to overwhelm your nose, to batter it into submission. You pass a perfume shop, and the air outside is so thick with rosewater and sandalwood that you could swear it's visible. Inside, glass vials glint in the candlelight, labeled with names like essence of violet or water of 1,000 flowers. One particularly confident concoction boasts elixir against miasma being the evil-smelling bad air that doctors thought spread disease. Doctors even prescribed scented gloves and masks to fend off illness, believing that pleasant smells could purify the air and protect you. Historians still debate whether this helped at all or just made the inevitable plague smell marginally nicer. It wasn't all roses and violets, though. Some fragrances were frankly horrifying. Musk extracted from the glands of deer, civet from the scent glands of civet cats, ingredients that today would make perfumers weep into their synthetic molecules. And don't get me started on the pomanders, hollow, perforated balls filled with aromatic spices that people carried or wore, swinging them gently to waft pleasant smells toward their noses like some medieval version of a car air freshener. You begin to realize that the Parisian smellscape wasn't just something people suffered through, it was something they fought, daily and creatively. Every vial of perfume was a tiny act of rebellion against the filth, a scented middle finger to the forces of decay. But still, as you inhale deeply, and immediately regret it, you know that beneath the layers of costly aroma, the city's true scent waits, patient and inescapable. And you, brave wanderer, must move on. Ahead lies the Seine, glittering faintly in the dusk. Surely a river offers some relief, you think. Surely. Ah. About that. You shuffle toward the banks of the Seine, desperate for a reprieve. A cool, riverside breeze, maybe even a hint of fresh water, surely that's not too much to ask? It is. It's far too much to ask. As you approach, the air grows heavy, dense, and foul in a way that suggests the river isn't so much a body of water as a moving, heaving swamp of decay. The Seine of 18th century Paris is no picturesque postcard scene. It is a wide, slow-flowing conveyor belt of everything the city wants to forget. You stop at the edge, and the stench wallops you. It's a pungent cocktail of rotting organic matter, human waste, dead fish, and something metallic that you can't quite place and don't want to investigate further. Some describe it as earthy. Others are less charitable. Historians still argue whether the Seine was genuinely more polluted than other European rivers of the time, but nobody contests that it was pretty much a giant, watery compost heap. Every street gutter, every overflowing chamber pot, every butcher's offcut eventually found its way into the river. People dumped trash directly into it with the same casual air you might have tossing a receipt into a waste bin. But here's the kicker, people still use the Seine. They washed their clothes in it. They washed themselves in it. They drank from it when they had no other choice, though drink might be too generous a term for what was essentially self-inflicted waterborne illness. The river even doubled as an open-air morgue. Bodies, both human and animal, floated along at times, bumping against the stone embankments like grotesque, waterlogged buoys. Historians still argue whether the city made genuine efforts to remove them quickly or just hoped they'd drift downstream and become someone else's problem. Still, the Seine had its defenders. Some insisted that if you caught it just after a rainstorm, when the filth was temporarily diluted, it smelled almost bearable, fresh, even. But that was a rare, fleeting miracle. More often, it reeked so badly that Parisians on bridges would press handkerchiefs to their faces and hurry their steps. You glance around and notice that certain spots along the river are avoided entirely. The fish markets are near the river for easy disposal of unwanted, unsold inventory. The tanners work close by too, better to dump vats of chemical-laced runoff straight into the flowing mess. As you stand here, trying not to gag, you realize, the Seine isn't a river. It's Paris's worst-kept secret, flowing in plain sight. There's a story that persists, whether myth or fact. Historians aren't sure, about a noblewoman who fainted on a bridge simply from catching a whiff too sharp, too sudden. Her maid, quick on her feet, revived her with a dash of perfume under the nose. A small mercy in a world where the rivers fought back. And yet, paradoxically, the Seine remained a romantic backdrop for many. Couples strolled along its edges in the evenings, handkerchiefs at the ready. Painters set up their easels nearby, trying to capture its misty light while pretending the smell was just an atmospheric bonus. You shift your weight, the dampness of the riverbank seeping into your shoes. The smell rises, tangling in your clothes, embedding itself in your hair. You'll carry this memory with you, no matter how many times you wash. Modern reconstructions of the Seine's 18th century odor describe it as a layered experience. First, the tang of rot, sharp and aggressive. Underneath, a subtler note of mold and mildew. Then a waxy, sweet undercurrent, death, lightly perfumed by the breeze. If there was a smell map of Paris, the Seine would be its grim centerpiece, an unmissable landmark you didn't even have to look for. You simply felt it, as much in your gut as in your nose. Still, standing there now, you realize you've grown, not used to it, exactly, but acclimated. It's like the city is conditioning you, smell by smell, to survive its worst. And with that cheerful thought, you take a final breath through your mouth, carefully, and move on. After all, there's a legend about a certain street ahead, one that supposedly smelled sweet. Historians still argue about that one, too. You shuffle away from the river, each step peeling you from the invisible glue of its stench. The air shifts slightly, and though it's far from fresh, something curious tickles your nose, an unexpected note, faint but unmistakable, vanilla. This is the Rue de Petit Champs, or so they say, and it's famous, or infamous, for its unusually pleasant aroma. Historians still argue whether this sweet-smelling street was a happy accident, a deliberate urban design, or just a fluke of wind currents on particularly lucky days. Some say bakers lined the street, their ovens leaking the scent of fresh brioche and custard tarts into the alleyway. Others insist it was the soap makers, boiling batches of perfumed bars that lent the air a sugar-spun note. You, hopeful, breathe deeper, and instantly regret it. Because while the top note may be vanilla, the base layers still reek of old refuse and whatever dubious liquid is trickling along the gutters. It's less a perfume and more a battleground where vanilla is doing its best but clearly losing. Still, compared to the cabbage cloud and the river stew, this is practically a vacation. You trudge onward, half seduced by the idea that maybe, just maybe, you've found Paris's best-smelling street. There's an old story, probably apocryphal, about a Parisian nobleman who insisted on taking this exact route every morning, just to start his day on the right nasal foot. He claimed the gentle sweetness cleansed the mind. Skeptics pointed out that the mind might be cleansed simply because everything else was overwhelmed. Modern scent historians, yes, that's a real job, have tried to reconstruct what might have caused the olfactory anomaly. Some argue that the combination of bakeries and soap works could have created temporary scent pockets. Others suggest that the narrowness of the street allowed less room for the general city stench to settle, and a lucky baker with a good yeast might have done the rest. And yet, despite the sweetness, there were always hidden dangers. The sweet smell, some warned, was deceptive, a siren's call that distracted from the loose cobblestones underfoot, or worse, the random discharges from windows above. One wrong step, and you could be dodging far more than just a bad smell. Walking here, you notice the buildings are tall and packed tightly together, trapping scents the way modern buildings trap heat. Without modern ventilation or sanitation, even a sweet-smelling street could turn sour with just a few unfortunate days of rain or heat. And here's the real kicker, if you paused long enough, even en route to Petit Champs, you'd eventually detect the grim undercurrent every Parisian knew to expect: mildew. It crept into everything. The walls wept with it. The wooden beams that held the houses upright drank it in. Mildew was the unofficial fifth element of 18th century Paris, after earth, air, fire, and water. Still, you linger. It's a rare indulgence. Compared to what you've already endured, the sulfur of the markets, the river's rancid kiss, this is like standing next to a bakery on a sleepy Sunday morning. Almost. You pass a soap maker's shop, the door ajar, and are treated to a fleeting burst of something citrusy and clean. Lemon balm, maybe. It's like finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk of smell experiences. Historians, bless them, still debate whether this street's reputation is based on fact or a combination of wishful thinking and selective memory. Maybe it never smelled that sweet, and travelers just latched onto the idea because their noses were too battered to resist a fairy tale. You can't help but feel a tiny pang of admiration for the poor Parisians who lived here, who managed to find pride in a street that, for a few precious minutes a day, didn't reek of death and despair. You tuck the memory away. A sweet-smelling street in the middle of a stinking metropolis, a tiny rebellion against the inevitable. It's almost romantic. Almost. You take a last sniff, one part bravery, one part desperation, and continue on, your nose already twitching in warning. Because just ahead lies another adventure in 18th century nasal cartography, the public toilets. And those? Those are a story all their own. You push forward, buoyed slightly by the memory of that faint, miraculous vanilla breeze, but not for long. The scentscape shifts again, more sinister now, and you instinctively brace yourself. Your instincts are right, up ahead is one of the great paradoxes of 18th century Paris, the public toilet. Imagine, if you will, a system designed to solve the city's waste problem, that somehow made everything worse. Public toilets, or latrines publics, were intended to keep the streets clean, to provide a designated place for, well, human necessities. In theory, a brilliant idea. In practice? You're about to find out. As you approach, the smell hits first, raw, acrid, and unapologetic. Not even the bravest perfumer dared set up shop nearby. The latrines were often just open pits with a low stone wall around them for a modicum of privacy, or humiliation, depending on your perspective. No flushing, no pipes. Just an open invitation for smells to stew under the open sky. Historians still argue whether these facilities represented progress or disaster. On paper, providing public waste disposal was revolutionary. But without proper maintenance, and let's face it, maintenance was not Paris's strong suit, the latrines quickly became little more than concentrated smell bombs. You stand a cautious distance away. Flies buzz industriously. The ground is dark with dampness, but you don't want to think too hard about what kind. Worse, the latrines often overflowed, especially after rain, sending rivers of filth trickling into the streets. City records show numerous complaints about ankle-deep sludge during particularly wet seasons. Some historians suggest this led to a kind of communal immunity, a hardening of the senses. Or maybe just widespread resignation. You might assume the smell would deter use, but these public toilets were incredibly popular. Why? Because the alternative was even worse, going in alleyways, corners, or simply wherever one pleased. In fact, those too squeamish for the public pits might resort to carrying bourdelus, little chamber pots designed for discreet use, even during church services. And yes, they did smell, but at least they were pourable. There's a famous anecdote, true or not, No one is sure about an English traveler who, unfamiliar with Parisian customs, mistook a public latrine for a market stall and tried to order cheese. His abrupt exit reportedly involved a great deal of undignified shrieking. And speaking of undignified, it's worth mentioning that for the most part, these toilets weren't segregated by gender. That's right, men and women alike, shoulders hunched, doing their business side by side in full view of anyone unlucky enough to pass by. You could argue it was the great equalizer, if you're feeling generous. Adding to the olfactory horror, the design sometimes included a small roof, trapping the smells beneath like a cruel, open-air crockpot. On hot days, it was said the scent could travel for blocks, a greasy, fetid mist that clung to clothing and skin. Naturally, Parisians developed coping mechanisms. Perfumed handkerchiefs were held constantly at the ready. Quickened steps, shallow breaths, strategic routes that gave the latrines a wide berth. Even the most battle-hardened locals had their tricks. Historians still argue whether the French authorities of the time genuinely cared about the sanitation problem or merely treated it as an inevitable side effect of urban life. There were efforts to improve things, but progress was glacial. It wasn't until the 19th century that real sewer systems started to transform the city's relationship with its own waste. For now, though, you scurry past, not daring to breathe too deeply. The public toilet recedes behind you, but the memory lingers, stubborn and cloying. You pause once you're clear, gulping fresher air, or at least, Paris's version of it. In the distance, beyond the grime and grit, something glitters, the homes of the rich and powerful. Maybe, you think, they have it better. Maybe their world smells sweeter. But as you'll soon learn, even gilded cages can reek. You drift toward the part of the city where wealth clutches most tightly, Paris's aristocratic heart, where silk-clad nobles glide between mansions and carriages rumble over cobbled streets. Surely, you think, surely the air will be fresher here, crisper, touched by the lavender and lemon that perfume the linen closets of the rich. Spoiler alert, it's not. You step into the shadow of an opulent townhouse, its windows gleaming with leaded glass, its wrought iron balconies heavy with blooms. At first, yes, there's a suggestion of roses in the air, of ambergris, of cloves and cinnamon, scents carefully curated, purchased at enormous expense. But the cover is thin. Like the powdered faces of the aristocracy themselves, these smells mask something less glamorous lurking beneath. You pass by an open window and the truth seeps out, sour sweat, damp wool, a tang of rot where fresh flowers have wilted in their vases. You inhale carefully and realize, these homes try to smell better, but they're fighting a losing battle. Historians still argue whether aristocratic homes were significantly cleaner than the common quarters, or just more richly perfumed. Plumbing, at this time, was a fantasy. Chamber pots were still the standard, and servants regularly emptied them, often directly into the street or hidden corners of the courtyard. Some mansions had privies tucked discreetly away, but without real drainage systems, they festered just the same. One particularly delightful fact, it was common practice to sprinkle perfume not just on the body, but on furniture, curtains, even walls. Yes, walls, because when wood paneling and thick tapestries soaked up decades of smoke, mildew, and human presence, a quick spritz of rose water could at least delay complete sensory defeat. You make your way along the street, dodging the dainty rivulets of refuse trickling from unseen gutters. The carriages that clatter past are plush inside, yes, but still bear the unfortunate whiff of the stables they frequent. Horses, after all, don't distinguish between the cobblestones outside a palace and those by the riverbank. There's an infamous story about a duchess who once hosted a grand ball, only to have her guests flee midway because an unseasonably warm night turned the perfumed air thick and sour, revealing what lay underneath, the accumulated body odors of hundreds of sweating dancers, trapped inside velvet and brocade. Perfume could only do so much. Historians still debate whether it was poor ventilation or sheer olfactory saturation that ruined the event, but the result was the same, the Grand Stink Ball, as it was mockingly dubbed. Inside the mansions, matters weren't much better. Kitchens, often tucked in basements or separate wings, churned out smells that mixed unpleasantly with those of the humans upstairs. Roasting meats, boiling stews, spoiled milk, and old grease, combined, they created a complex scent profile that no amount of beeswax candles could erase. And while gardens were cultivated with obsessive care, even these could betray unpleasant truths. Manure was the fertilizer of choice, and the rich, for all their finery, were not immune to the scent of cow dung wafting up between the roses and lavender. You realize, as you wander past yet another sprawling mansion with gold-trimmed windows, that wealth didn't grant immunity from the great equalizer, smell. It could be masked, delayed, disguised, but never truly defeated. Modern scholars still marvel at the lengths to which the 18th century elite would go to craft an illusion of fragrant purity, an illusion constantly under siege by the reality of life without sanitation. Some suggest that the development of French perfumery was less an artistic flourish and more a desperate necessity born from these gilded cages. As you turn a corner, the air grows denser, thicker with the overlapping sense of privilege and decay. Ahead, you spot a more working-class district, where leather and tanning dominate the atmosphere. But that, brave traveler, is another kind of nasal assault entirely. You gather yourself and head toward the city's industrial underbelly, the tanneries. If you thought cabbage clouds and the Saint's foul breath were bad, brace yourself. You're about to step into Paris's leather district, a place where the very air seems to crack and snap with sharp, biting smells. The scent announces itself long before you arrive, riding the breeze like an invisible slap. It's a harsh, metallic stench layered with something darker and heavier, rotting flesh. You wrinkle your nose and press on. Tanneries in the 18th century were the necessary evil of any large city. Leather was in constant demand for shoes, belts, gloves, bookbindings, and more. But the process to create it? It was disgusting. First, animal hides were soaked in lime and urine to loosen the hair. Then, they were scraped clean, pounded, and treated with a foul slurry of water, dung, and tannins derived from tree bark. The final product was beautiful. The process to get there? Nightmarish. Historians still argue whether Parisian tanners had it worse than their European neighbors. Some point out that at least Paris had a few regulations meant to keep tanneries on the outskirts of respectable districts. Others note that these rules were rarely enforced, and besides, the stink had no respect for property lines. You edge closer to a tannery, and the smell becomes so thick it's almost textured. There's a deep sourness to it, a sour that clings to the back of your throat and refuses to leave. Workers move busily inside, hauling dripping hides and stirring vats that bubble ominously. Their clothes are stained, their skin toughened, and they move with the brisk efficiency of people long past caring about the assault on their senses. There's a story about a diplomat visiting Paris who was taken to a tannery as part of a city tour, an early attempt at urban transparency. The diplomat reportedly made it 2 minutes before losing his breakfast in a nearby gutter. Historians still debate whether this was an exaggeration or if the ambassador just had a weak stomach. And here's the twist. Despite the unbearable smell, the tannery district was considered a mark of economic success. Leatherwork was crucial, and tanners held an important, if not exactly glamorous, place in society. They even had their own guilds and saints, St. Crispin for shoemakers and tanners alike. You notice the layout of the district is strangely practical. Tanneries are clustered near water sources, usually the same porcelain you met earlier. Water is essential for rinsing and soaking hides, and it provides a convenient drain for waste runoff, never mind what it does to the river's already grim reputation. In the summer, the smell intensifies, cooked by the sun into a thick, choking haze that hangs over the streets. Parisians lucky enough to live elsewhere took pains to avoid the area, but if you needed a new pair of boots or a saddle, you had no choice but to brave it. To survive the olfactory onslaught, some tanneries hung herbs, bay leaves, sage, rosemary, around their workshops, a kind of primitive air freshening system. It barely helped, but it was a gesture. Others brewed vats of strong vinegar nearby, hoping the sharp tang would neutralize the stink. It didn't. Modern researchers who've tried to replicate the old tanning process report it as one of the most punishing smells they've ever encountered, somewhere between burning hair, wet dog, and decomposing roadkill, with a bonus hint of sour milk for good measure. You step carefully past, your boots slipping a little on the damp cobbles, slick with a mixture of water and who knows what else. The smell curls into your nostrils, sets up camp, and refuses to leave. And just when you think you can't take any more, you realize the tanneries weren't even the worst part. No, that honor belongs to the ancient, crumbling buildings themselves, structures that, over time, developed their own, distinct and dreadful aroma. But that is, quite literally, another story. You stagger out of the tannery district, lungs battered, nose traumatized, only to find yourself facing another olfactory gauntlet, the buildings themselves. You might think stone and timber couldn't smell, but 18th century Parisian architecture had a way of turning against you. Imagine centuries of dampness seeping into porous limestone, of wooden beams soaked and re-soaked by rain, rot, and the occasional chamber pot mishap. Add to that the smoke from thousands of fireplaces, the grease from countless kitchens, and the mildew that thrived in every dark, unventilated nook. The result? Buildings that didn't just look old, they smelled old. You lean against a wall for a moment to catch your breath and instantly regret it. The stone is damp, slick, and exudes a musty, sour odor, like wet socks left in a gym bag for a month. Historians still argue whether the older buildings in Paris were inherently worse than newer constructions or if it was simply a matter of accumulated abuse. Either way, they had a particular, unforgettable scent: mildew, smoke, human presence, and despair. It wasn't just the walls. The wooden floorboards inside creaked not just under weight but under the burden of centuries of trapped smells. Tapestries, drapes, and mattresses acted like sponges, soaking up the city's stench and holding onto it with grim determination. Regular cleaning was out of the question. Soap and water were luxuries, and even if you could scrub, what good would it do in an environment where filth was a constant? You peer into a dark alley where a building leans precariously against its neighbor, the two structures holding each other up like drunks after a long night. The narrowness traps the smell, making it stronger. Mold grows in thick patches along the base of the walls. Sometimes, when the wind hits just right, the whole alley exhales a breath of sour, fermented air that makes you step back involuntarily. There's an infamous tale of a Parisian playwright who hosted salons in his crumbling house. Guests would gather, wineglasses in hand, pretending not to notice the mildew stains creeping up the wallpaper or the damp rot smell that clung to the upholstered chairs. One poet quipped that the house was so alive with mold that he expected the walls to start reciting verses of their own. Historians still debate whether this was clever exaggeration or simple observation. And it wasn't just the interiors that betrayed you. Roofs leaked, soaking insulation, which, let's be honest, was mostly straw or horsehair, and with every heavy rain, the smells of damp and decay intensified. Chimneys, clogged with soot and bird nests, coughed back smoke that settled inside instead of escaping into the air. Even candle smoke added its layer, perfuming homes with a greasy, burnt scent. You notice the irony. The wealthier quarters might have been less exposed to tannery stench or market rot, but they couldn't escape their own homes turning against them. The very materials meant to protect and shelter conspired to turn the city into a living museum of miasma. Modern preservationists, restoring these ancient buildings, often talk about the old smell lingering in the wood and stone. Some even argue it's part of the charm. But standing here, nose twitching, you're pretty sure charm isn't the first word that comes to mind. And still, somehow, people lived, laughed, and loved inside these breathing, crumbling structures. They threw lavish parties, hosted raucous dinners, penned letters and manifestos by smoky candlelight, all while marinating in an atmosphere that today would send a building inspector running for a hazmat suit. You move on, each breath reminding you that Paris's smell map wasn't just drawn by streets and markets. It was etched into the very bones of the city. Up ahead, flickering lamplight signals a shift. Doctors' offices, apothecaries, places where science and superstition collide in their attempts to explain the strange and sinister smells that permeate everything. Brace yourself. The theories you're about to encounter are every bit as odd as the odors they sought to explain. You drift toward a cluster of somber buildings, their windows shuttered, their doors discreet. Here lies the city's attempt at understanding its own reek: doctors' offices, apothecaries, the rare university lecture hall. You step lightly, careful not to disturb the quiet, though the air itself seems to hum with a different kind of noise, the murmur of misguided medical theories. The first scent you notice is sharp and medicinal: vinegar, camphor, maybe something floral trying desperately to override the sharper notes. You glance through a window and spot bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, thick swaths of rosemary and lavender being the poor man's shield against disease. In 18th century Paris, the theory of disease was as murky as the Seine. Germs? Microscopic organisms? Forget it. Miasma was the real villain, or so they believed. Miasma, the idea that foul-smelling air itself carried death, seeping into your lungs and delivering illness like a bad telegram. Historians still argue whether this belief made things better or worse, but one thing's for sure: it made Paris smell even weirder. Doctors advised citizens to fight bad air with good smells. Vinegar was splashed across floors, herbs were burned to cleanse rooms, and perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a prescription. You might be advised to carry a nosegay, a little bouquet of sweet-smelling flowers, or a pomander filled with cloves, cinnamon, and amber to ward off the invisible demons swirling around you. You pause outside an apothecary, its doorway flanked by glass jars of mysterious powders and oils. From inside comes the rich scent of spices: cardamom, nutmeg, dried citrus peels. It's almost pleasant until it mixes, inevitably, with the underlying smells of decay and damp that not even the strongest cinnamon bark can hide. There's a story, probably apocryphal, of a Parisian doctor who insisted that the best cure for the miasma was to bathe once a week in vinegar and rose petals. his patients dutifully soaked, only to reek like sour salad dressing for days afterward. Historians still debate whether he genuinely believed in the treatment or just enjoyed torturing the noses of the bourgeoisie. Inside these offices, the battle against smell was both earnest and futile. Doctors stuffed dried flowers into masks, creating the famous beak-like plague doctor visage. Although mostly associated with earlier centuries, the habit lingered, the belief that if you couldn't smell the bad air, it couldn't hurt you. A comforting lie, much like the idea that a sachet of herbs could purify a room full of mildew. Medical pamphlets of the time warned readers to avoid low-lying areas and stagnant breezes. They recommended placing fresh flowers around the home and airing out rooms with drafts of clean air, though in a city like Paris, finding clean air was a bit like finding a polite goose in a bakery. And yet, not all their efforts were wasted. Burning herbs like sage and juniper did have mild antibacterial properties. Vinegar, too, had some cleansing power. It was a far cry from germ theory, but not entirely useless either. Historians, ever cautious, point out that while the miasma theory was wrong, some of the habits it encouraged, like fumigating rooms, weren't the worst ideas. As you move through the narrow streets, the smells of medicine mingle uneasily with the city's natural funk. It's a strange symphony, the bracing sharpness of vinegar, the thick sweetness of decaying herbs, the faint peppery bite of crushed cloves. It would almost be interesting if it didn't make your stomach churn. Even today, scholars try to piece together how these smells would have truly layered in real life. Reconstructed scent maps, yes, that's a real thing, attempt to plot the olfactory experience of old Paris, and let's just say, scratch and sniff technology has not yet made one. You press on, deeper into the medicinal maze, wondering if anyone ever truly believed they were winning the war against the city's stench. Maybe it was all just theater, an elaborate ritual to give people hope. Up ahead, a different kind of theater awaits, the grand experiment of a man-made smellscape, where people tried to outwit the city's funk with careful planning and selective route mapping. Spoiler, it didn't go quite as planned. You follow the faint scent trail into a quieter quarter, where the air holds a strange promise, less of relief, more of curiosity. Here's where you encounter the famed, and somewhat infamous, smell map of Paris. Not a paper map that you can fold and crease in your pocket, but a mental blueprint, a lived knowledge of which streets to favor and which to avoid based on the invisible rivers of stink. Historians still argue whether this so-called smell map was ever officially drawn or if it existed only in the collective mind of Parisians desperate to outmaneuver their city's pungent realities. Some sources hint at hand-sketched guides passed among those in the know, marking areas of tolerable odor with hopeful crosses and the real danger zones with bold, aggressive excess. You, however, have only your nose, and the faint whispers of reputation to guide you. Take the Rue Saint-Honoré. By some miracle, or perhaps because of its slight elevation and better drainage, it earned a rare reputation for being less terrible than its neighbors. Locals claim that, after a rainstorm, the smell actually improved, as if the city had been given a quick rinse. Skeptical? So were they. But when faced with the alternative, even a half-clean street was cause for celebration. The good streets often had bakeries or churches to anchor their aroma profiles. Freshly baked bread and wafting incense could almost make you forget about the refuse pooling in the gutters. In contrast, streets near the Seine, the tanneries, or the public latrines were scent death traps, best navigated quickly and with a strong cloth pressed to your face. You imagine the locals as human bloodhounds, noses constantly twitching, adjusting their daily routes according to the olfactory weather. A merchant might take a longer, more winding path to market just to dodge the fishmonger's quarter or the dank alleys where garbage sat in festering heaps. There's a popular anecdote about an opera singer who refused to travel through certain streets to reach the theater, insisting instead on an elaborate zigzag journey. She claimed the heavy air of the butcher's market would ruin her voice for the night. Whether true or apocryphal, it speaks to the city's peculiar relationship with its own smellscape. Curiously, scholars today debate whether these unofficial smell maps led to early social stratification, whether the well-off gravitated towards slightly sweeter neighborhoods, leading the worst-smelling sectors to the working class. It's an idea that sounds suspiciously modern, but human noses have always had a way of influencing human choices. You walk on, noticing how even now, in this supposedly better district, the smells layer like sediments. There's the yeasty warmth of a boulangerie battling the acrid tang of burning wood, a faint trace of urine from an alleyway tucked too close to the main thoroughfare, and a sweet, rotting note that suggests fruit carts past their prime. Mapping by scent wasn't just survival, it was an art. Locals memorized wind patterns, seasons, even the time of day. In the early morning, Before the heat baked everything into a fetid stew, some streets were almost bearable. By midday, the sun drew out every hidden stink, and only the bravest or most desperate ventured into certain corners. And then there were the festivals, public events where the sheer number of unwashed bodies pressed into tight streets could create temporary stink storms, massive and mobile. The smell map had to adjust accordingly, a living, breathing document in the minds of its citizens. There's a certain weird beauty in it, you think. In the way the human brain can adapt, can catalog, can choose to find pathways not by sight but by scent. It's a skill long forgotten in modern cities, with their air fresheners and underground sewage systems. Still, you wonder what it must have been like to live your whole life guided by such invisible, odorous trails. Navigating not by landmarks, but by the ebb and flow of decay and cleanliness. Ahead, you sense the air thinning slightly, an indication that you're heading toward one of the rare places where smell could be a friend rather than a foe, the manicured gardens kept by the aristocracy. Don't get your hopes up too much, though. Even paradise, in Paris, has its own secrets. You follow the thinning smell like a pilgrim chasing a mirage, and soon the narrow streets open up into something rarer in 18th century Paris, space. Green, manicured, carefully controlled space. You've reached the Royal Gardens, one of the few places in the city where the air could pretend to be fresh. At first, you can almost believe it. Roses bloom in tight, orderly rows, their heavy scent pulling at the tired muscles in your nose. Lavender bushes tremble in the breeze, tossing their clean, herbaceous perfume toward you. Orange trees, real ones, not the scented oils or fake pomanders of the perfumers, release sharp, sweet notes that flirt at the edge of your senses. You breathe deep. It's not perfect, nothing is, but it's the closest you've come to clean air all day. Historians still argue whether these gardens were genuinely open to the public or only to those with the right connections. Regardless, for those who managed to sneak in or be invited, it was a rare olfactory vacation. But, of course, nothing in Paris could stay pure for long. The gardens had their own, quieter undercurrents of less than ideal aromas. For one, the water features, grand fountains and reflecting pools, were stagnant more often than not. Without proper filtration or drainage, they quickly became breeding grounds for algae and mosquitoes, emitting a faint, unpleasant musk. Then there were the fertilizers. Parisian gardens were lavish, yes, but nature didn't create those prize roses and plump peonies without a little help. Animal manure, mainly horse and cow, was worked into the soil in liberal amounts. On hot days, the sweet floral air had a base note of unmistakable dung. You pause by a neatly clipped hedge maze, noting how the scent of boxwood, a sharp, almost catty smell, competes with the flowers. Boxwood was fashionable, but not exactly olfactory friendly. Some visitors claimed the hedges smelled like old socks. Others insisted it was more earthy. Historians, with their typical flair, still debate whether boxwood was planted for aesthetic reasons alone or whether its pungency was thought to repel pests, or maybe even, optimistically, bad spirits. At least in the gardens, the stink wasn't overwhelming. It was manageable, a background hum rather than a full orchestral assault. Here, you could almost imagine Paris as it appeared in paintings, gilded, serene, picturesque. There's a famous anecdote about Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who was said to wander these very gardens with a perfumed fan held delicately to her face, sniffing the roses while pointedly ignoring the faint odors of pond scum and fertilizer. Some said she insisted on extra lavender being planted near her favorite seating spot to mask the unpleasant whiffs. Whether she truly had that much influence over the garden's layout remains a topic of gentle scholarly squabbling. Even so, the gardens served a vital role in the smell map of Paris. They were safe zones, places where the city's poorest smells were, if not eradicated, at least diluted. A clever Parisian might plan their day to pass through as many green spaces as possible, breathing deep and stockpiling fresh air for the streets ahead. It's tempting to linger here, to bask in the half-illusion of purity. But you know better. The sun is setting, and as night falls, Paris will shift again. The smells that the daylight suppressed will begin to rise, like ghosts from every crack and gutter. The city never truly sleeps, and neither do its odors. You cast a last longing glance at the swaying lavender and trembling rose bushes. Then, squaring your shoulders, and your stomach, you move on. Night is coming. And Paris at night smells different. You step away from the gardens just as the light begins to drain from the sky, the golden haze of dusk giving way to deeper shadows. Night falls on Paris, and with it, the smells shift. If you thought the city was bold by day, wait until you meet it after dark. The first change is almost imperceptible, a cooling of the air, a settling of the dust. The streets quiet slightly, but the smells? They get louder. In the absence of the sun's baking heat, the heavy, aggressive stenches retreat, replaced by subtler, lingering ghosts. Gone are the sharp, eye-watering stabs of sour cabbage and sun-baked refuse. In their place comes a softer, though no less pervasive, melange, stale beer from the taverns, smoke from hearth fires coughing into the night air, the faint iron tang of blood from butchers cleaning up after the day's slaughter. Even the scene changes character, its daytime reek softening into a more passive, but no less unpleasant, breath of decay. You walk carefully, the cobblestones slippery with the condensation of night. Here and there, candles glow behind shutters, the smells of dinners long gone cold seep out, onions, stewed meats, bread crusts now hardening to stone. Historians still argue whether night improved or worsened the smellscape of Paris. Some say the cooler air tamped down the worst of it, allowed a brief respite. Others insist that night merely concentrated the stink, pooling it low to the ground where it clung to ankles and the hems of dresses like a bad memory. You pass a tavern door flung wide open, and a wave of fermenting ale and unwashed bodies barrels out. Music, too, shrill fiddles and the slap of clogs on wood. Inside, men and women drink, sing, and laugh, their own personal stink storms mingling merrily above the clatter of mugs and the slap of cards on tables. It's easy to forget, in the haze of modernity, that humans smelled different back then. Daily baths were rare, soap was expensive, and deodorant as we know it? A dream centuries away. Instead, people relied on the same old tricks: perfume, vinegar washes, a quick rub-down with cloths dipped in lavender water. Historians still puzzle over how bearable it all was, day to day. Did people simply adjust their expectations? Did the nose learn to forgive what it couldn't escape? You pass through a narrower street now, where the overhanging houses lean close enough to touch overhead. The trapped air here smells of damp wood, mouse droppings, and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit from a market stall left to its own devices. Somewhere nearby, someone is burning something best left unidentified: rubber, leather, sending a greasy, cloying smoke into the blackness. There's a quiet, almost conspiratorial feel to Paris at night. People move with a different rhythm, slower, less urgent. Lovers meet in alleyways, sharing whispered promises and the smells of wine and whetstone. Pickpockets and cut purses slink in shadows, their passing marked more by a whiff of stale breath and dirty linen than by any sound. The night opens up in pockets. The bakeries, already at work preparing bread for the morning, send warm yeasty scents into the cool air, a rare mercy. The charnel houses, where bodies await burial, emit a grim, sweet note if you wander too close. Paris, at night, is a different city, mapped not by sights but by these olfactory landmarks. There's a famous story about an English visitor who described nighttime Paris as a city of fragrances, both foul and fair, twining in the darkness like lovers who cannot bear to part. Poetic, perhaps, but you suspect he spent most of his time near the gardens. You press on, deeper into the sleeping city, nose twitching, senses sharp. The night smells thinner, yes, but more treacherous too. Without the daylight to blunt the edges, the odors become more intimate, less public. The breath of a city whispered rather than shouted. As you round another corner, a gust of cool, damp air rushes past you, carrying a mingled scent of coal smoke and crushed autumn leaves. You close your eyes for a moment, breathing carefully through your mouth. Paris at night may be quieter, but it's no less alive, and no less pungent. Up ahead, the seasons wait to show you their own tricks. Because in Paris, even the smells knew how to change their clothes with the calendar. You tread carefully into the deeper folds of the city as the seasons themselves seem to rise up around you. In 18th century Paris, the passing of time wasn't just marked by the tilt of the sun or the shedding of leaves, it was inked into the very air, each season scripting its own chapter of the city's olfactory saga. Now, the chill of early autumn has settled in. The smells around you have softened from their brutal summer highs. The heat no longer bakes the garbage into a sticky paste, nor does it lift the sharper, more aggressive stenches into the air. Instead, the city smells lower, earthier, mustier. There's the unmistakable dampness of whetstone, the first bite of wood smoke from chimneys struggling to shake off the evening cold, and the sour sweet scent of fallen leaves beginning to rot where the gutters clog. Historians still argue whether spring or summer was worse for the city's smellscape. Some claim summer's heat turned Paris into a massive, open-air compost bin, accelerating every decay process nature could dream up. Others suggest spring was more insidious, cooler but wetter, perfect conditions for mold to bloom and for garbage to ferment under a gentler sun. You imagine the nightmare that was summer, streets where refuse oozed rather than sat, where the stench was a living thing that pressed against your skin. Leatherworkers' hides rotted faster. Bakers baked less often to avoid the unbearable heat of the ovens. Even the sane, already a villain in the best of times, festered like an infected wound. A particularly grim seasonal note? In summer, the number of open-air burials skyrocketed. Before modern embalming, bodies were interred quickly, and sometimes not quickly enough. There's a reason perfumed handkerchiefs became a Parisian summer essential, right up there with a fan and the firm will to live. And then came winter, when the smells didn't so much disappear as freeze. The cold air stiffened them, held them in place, mummified them temporarily. The horse manure, the rotting vegetables, the human waste, all still there, just paused. Walking the streets in winter might offer a brief reprieve, but it also came with its own challenges. The soot-heavy fog that settled low to the ground, a mix of coal smoke and chimney soot, coating everything in a fine layer of grime. Winter smells different, not better, just differently bad. Like someone turned down the volume but left the bass booming. You could still smell the river when the ice cracked, still catch the occasional puff of tannery runoff. Historians debate whether people genuinely enjoyed winter for its ability to mute the city's olfactory offenses or if they simply had no choice but to pretend they did, huddled in their unheated homes, surrounded by damp and the faint stink of old wood smoke and older bed linens. Spring was the tease. Rain washed the streets, yes, but also stirred up the hidden filth, trickling it into new and unexpected corners. The smell of thawing mud, mixed with whatever had been frozen there all winter, was not the delightful freshness we associate with modern springtime. Flowers bloomed, but so did the mold in every poorly ventilated room, and every garden fertilized liberally with manure gave off its own ripe, pastoral stench. You walk through a narrow passage where the season's signature smell is particularly strong: wet stone, cold iron, and the faint, tired exhale of wood smoke. It's oddly comforting, this muted assault. Less aggressive, more melancholy. There's a folk saying from the time: the nose rests in winter, mourns in spring, fights in summer, and prays in autumn. You can almost hear it whispered on the wind as you trudge on, your boots clicking against the slick stones. The seasons didn't just change the smells, they changed how Parisians lived them. In summer, windows were thrown open, not for relief, but because keeping the stink inside was worse. In winter, doors were sealed tight against the cold, trapping the smells of cooking, smoking, and unwashed bodies in a concentrated stew. Spring was for scrubbing, for dumping buckets of water onto cobblestones, for trying, vainly, to refresh what nature had already claimed. Even now, in this cooler season, you can feel it, the slow, stubborn churn of the city's breath, shifting gears as the calendar turns. But there's still more to uncover. Desperate measures people took to fight back, little tricks and hacks to wrest some control from the chaos. Lavender satchels, vinegar wipes, and stranger methods yet. Trust me, you're going to need them where you're heading next. You pull your cloak tighter against the crisp night air, and as you walk, you begin to notice a curious thing: not all smells are accidents. Some are deliberate defenses, small, desperate shields against the overwhelming odor tide of 18th century Paris. They float here and there like tiny lifeboats on a sea of stink. Your nose catches one now, a faint, sharp tang of vinegar cutting through the musty dampness. You glance sideways and spot a housemaid vigorously scrubbing the doorstep with a bucket of water spiked heavily with vinegar. It's no accident. Vinegar was one of the most trusted allies in the eternal battle against foul air. Cheap, potent, and easy to get, it was splashed onto floors, wiped onto walls, even sniffed directly when the smell around you became unbearable. Historians still argue whether vinegar was used more for cleaning or as a personal air purifier. Some sources describe people dabbing it under their noses or soaking cloths in it to hold against their faces while walking. Others talk about vinegar-soaked sponges tucked into decorative holders, primitive scent diffusers designed to radiate some kind of sharp, nostril-cleansing relief. You press on, and soon the scent changes. Now it's lavender, strong, powdery, and slightly medicinal. Lavender was another mainstay of olfactory defense. Wealthier Parisians stuffed little sachets with dried lavender and carried them in their pockets or tucked them into their bosoms. Homes had sprigs tucked behind door frames and under pillows. Some even stitched lavender into their wigs, yes, wigs, to fend off the everyday odors that clung to hair like desperate barnacles. There's a wonderful, if slightly grim, anecdote about a Parisian dandy who fainted at an opera not from heat or poor health but because he had overloaded his body with so many lavender sachets and perfume flasks in his pockets that, combined with the unwashed heat of the crowd, he simply tipped over from sensory overload. Historians still debate whether this story is charming myth or a cautionary tale about overdosing on even the nicest smells. Other remedies were more inventive. Some Parisians carried oranges studded with cloves, the original pomander. They were both fashionable and practical, a little luxury item that doubled as a portable, nose-saving grace. You imagine walking the streets with a pomander held discreetly close, a clove-spiked citrus shield between you and the city's unrelenting aroma assault. Not that everyone could afford such luxuries. For the less wealthy, a simple cloth soaked in eau de cologne or even just strong spirits would have to do. Or sometimes, just a hand hastily clamped over the mouth and nose. You pass a street vendor now, hawking bundles of dried herbs. Rosemary, thyme, mint, all considered protective. Rosemary, especially, was believed to purify the air and fend off disease. You notice the vendor's cart smells sharply green and resinous, a brief, startling counterpoint to the mildewed stone and faint horse muck wafting up from the street. Historians argue whether these methods were more psychological comfort than actual protection. Did they really cleanse the air, or just make it more tolerable? Modern science shrugs and says probably a bit of both. Vinegar has mild antibacterial properties. Lavender repels some insects. And a pomander in your hand, while unlikely to kill any germs, at least gave you something nice to sniff while navigating the olfactory minefield. You have to admire the ingenuity. In a world without sewer systems, garbage collection, or a proper understanding of hygiene, people did what they could. They fought the stench with whatever weapons they could muster, herbs, oils, strong drink, stubbornness. And sometimes they fought by simply refusing to acknowledge the smell at all. There's a particularly telling diary entry from a Parisian woman who wrote that she no longer noticed the scent of the river after 20 years of living by it. Not because it had improved, but because, she wrote, it became part of the air, like the breeze or the mist. You continue onward, breathing shallowly, grateful for every pocket of lavender or vinegar you encounter. They're fleeting, but in this city, fleeting victories are still victories. But while the locals had developed their tricks, the outsiders, the foreign visitors, they weren't nearly so resilient, and their noses had quite a lot to say about the state of Parisian air. You shuffle onward, nose faintly relieved by lingering hints of lavender and vinegar, only to find yourself stumbling into yet another layer of Paris's scent tapestry, the opinions of those who didn't live here. Foreign visitors. Outsiders. Fresh noses unaccustomed to the city's unique bouquet. You can almost imagine their horror. They arrived wide-eyed and hopeful, only to have Paris greet them with an invisible slap to the face. Diaries, travelogues, and letters from the 18th century are full of wide-eyed observations, some earnest, some dripping with sarcasm, all united by one common theme: Paris stinks. You pass by an inn where weary travelers are arriving, and you half expect them to clutch their noses before even stepping out of their carriages. The English, in particular, seemed almost gleeful in their disgust. One British visitor famously wrote that Paris smells as if the whole city is perfumed with a compost heap marinated in old socks. Another insisted that Parisian air was so thick with rot that one could slice it and serve it for supper. Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerated, a convenient way to feel superior to the French, or whether they captured an uncomfortable truth. It's likely a bit of both. After all, travelers were used to their own city's smells. London and Amsterdam were hardly fragrant utopias, but Paris managed to make an impression even on seasoned urban noses. You chuckle softly as you recall one particularly colorful account, a German nobleman who brought with him a personal stash of perfumed gloves and insisted on wearing them at all times, even while eating. He refused to touch anything without a layer of violet-scented leather between his skin and the grimy world. Historians love to retell this story, though they still debate whether it says more about Paris or about one very particular man's standards. Foreign visitors noted not just the what but the where. The fish markets, the butcher's stalls, the Seine, all got specific, gleeful mentions. So did the streets near the Palais Royal, which, despite its grandeur, seemed incapable of resisting the city's greater olfactory currents. Even the supposedly pristine gardens were noted for smelling suspiciously of manure, despite all the rose bushes and orange trees. And it wasn't just the air. Complaints about the interiors of homes, theaters, and taverns litter travel journals. Visitors remarked on the ripe humanity of crowded spaces, polite code for too many unwashed bodies crammed into too small a room. One Englishwoman wrote that attending a play in Paris was an exercise in patience and breath-holding, punctuated only by the occasional waft of burnt candles and stale beer. You pass a man in fine traveling clothes pinching his nose delicately as he tries to navigate a puddle of something he definitely doesn't want to identify. He catches your eye and gives a look, half pity, half panic, that says everything about his experience so far. You nod in solidarity. You get it. Of course, some visitors manage to find the charm in it. A few romantic souls waxed lyrical about the earthiness of Paris, describing it as a city that lived and breathed in ways their more sanitized hometowns did not. It is the scent of life itself, one Italian poet wrote. Foul, fragrant, and forever changing. Modern scholars like to point out that these outsiders' accounts, while often brutal, offer invaluable windows into what Parisians themselves had simply come to accept. For locals, the smells were like background noise. For visitors, they were headlines in bold type. And yet, despite the stink, despite the assaults on every fresh nose that crossed into its tangled streets, Paris retained its magic. People still came. They came for the art, the fashion, the philosophers, the gardens, even if those gardens occasionally smelled more of manure than magnolia. You inhale carefully, cautiously, and smile to yourself. The city might not have smelled sweet, but it had character. A nose-wrinkling, eye-watering kind of character, sure. But character nonetheless. Up ahead, the streets widen. Broader boulevards, grander houses. You're nearing the part of the story where Paris, belatedly, begins to realize it might have a bit of a smell problem, and starts taking the first halting, stumbling steps toward fixing it. You step onto one of Paris's broader boulevards, your feet crunching over a surface that, astonishingly, appears to have been swept, recently, even. The air, while not fresh exactly, feels less aggressive here. It smells tired, as if the city itself has paused, catching its breath before another assault. You've arrived at the beginning of something strange, Paris realizing that maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to smell like this forever. Historians still argue when exactly the tide began to turn. Some say it was the Enlightenment, with its pesky obsession with science and cleanliness. Others point to royal edicts and half-hearted municipal reforms. Either way, by the late 18th century, people were starting to get ideas. Wild, radical ideas like, what if we clean things up a little? The first feeble attempts were small and often laughable. Officials ordered the streets to be swept more regularly, not daily, heavens no, but weekly if possible. Rakers and sweepers were hired, usually the poorest of the poor, to shove the city's muck into great, stinking piles to be carted away. Eventually, when someone got around to it. You pass one such unfortunate now, a thin, bent figure with a worn broom and a cart already overflowing with refuse. He works slowly, not so much clearing the street as rearranging the filth. Still, it's progress. Sort of. There were also new laws, on paper, at least, about dumping chamber pots. Instead of the traditional shout and toss from the second floor, people were encouraged to use designated waste spots or to empty their pots during specific hours. Historians still argue whether these laws were ever enforced. Evidence suggests most Parisians politely ignored them, preferring tradition and gravity over regulation. Then there was the matter of wastewater. In theory, gutters were supposed to channel rain and waste away from the streets. In practice, the gutters often clogged, turning streets into shallow, evil-smelling rivers. Proposals for covered sewers were floated but generally dismissed as too expensive, too complicated, or too risky to disturb the delicate filth ecosystem. Some reforms, however, were more successful. Fountains began popping up across the city, not ornamental, but practical, providing cleaner water, well, cleaner by 18th century standards, to the masses. The Fontaine de Innocence, for example, became both a landmark and a lifeline, though the line between drinking water and washing water was often blurry. And there were, of course, the perfume projects. Certain city officials believed that if you couldn't remove the smells, you could at least cover them up. Public spaces were sometimes doused with herbal infusions or vinegar solutions, in much the same way a teenager might try to hide a disastrous cooking experiment with half a can of air freshener. A particularly ambitious plan suggested lining the Seine with gardens and flowers to mask its notorious odor. Beautiful in theory, utterly ineffective in practice. The river simply shrugged off the scent of roses, bulldozing past it with the overwhelming might of rotting fish, sewage, and chemical runoff. Still, the ideas kept coming. Indoor plumbing was whispered about in the grander houses, a luxury only the richest could even dream of. Some aristocrats commissioned private drainage systems, primitive, crude, but a start. Historians argue whether these early experiments in hygiene were successful or simply pretentious, but they planted seeds. And the biggest seed of all? Public health. Doctors, philosophers, and even politicians began connecting the dots between filth and illness. Miasma theory, still king of medical thinking, held that bad smells caused disease. So naturally, if you reduce the smells, you might reduce the sickness. Simple, logical, and wrong, but hey, points for effort. You pass a building proudly displaying a plaque declaring it part of a clean street initiative. The air here is, if not pleasant, at least less antagonistic. It smells mostly of smoke and damp stone, with only a faint undertone of rot, progress you can sniff. Of course, these reforms were slow, patchy, and often sabotaged by sheer human stubbornness. But they marked the beginning of a long, winding road toward the Paris we know today, wide boulevards, sparkling fountains, and a river that no longer actively assaults your senses. You walk on, past the sweepers and the fountains, the half-hearted reforms and the wholehearted shrugs. Paris was waking up, sniffing itself, and realizing maybe a little less aroma wouldn't be the worst thing. Ahead, one final turn remains in your journey, how the memory of all these smells, rank, sweet, unbearable, has been preserved, studied, and even, astonishingly, recreated in modern times. Because some people, it turns out, just can't leave well enough alone. You make your way through streets now quieter, less oppressive. The city has begun to slumber, but your journey isn't quite finished. Ahead lies a modern curiosity, something few would expect and even fewer would seek out voluntarily, the study, and in some cases, the recreation, of old smells. Yes, believe it or not, scholars today work painstakingly to recover and catalog the lost sense of history, Paris is included. Welcome to the world of olfactory archaeology, where the past isn't just seen or heard, it's smelled. You might wonder, who wants to bring back the stench of 18th century Paris? Historians still argue whether this endeavor is more about curiosity or masochism. Some believe it's essential to fully understand the lives of people in the past, others think it's the academic version of poking a bruise just to see if it still hurts. You pass a museum, small, tucked between grander buildings, where exhibits don't just showcase portraits and maps, but also scent recreations. Researchers, using historical texts, records, and a dash of chemical wizardry, have tried to bottle the aroma of old Paris. You shudder, imagining the effort it took to synthesize the river's deathly musk or the tannery district's unforgettable tang. Inside, visitors can sniff carefully recreated smells, the marketplace, with its rancid fish and wilting vegetables, the public latrines, recreated with what one reviewer generously called mildly offensive realism, even the sweet, deceitful air of the fabled Route de Petits Champs, laced with phantom vanilla and despair. Some scents are gentler, a recreation of a perfumer's shop, heavy with rosewater and bergamot, the lavender sachets of a middle-class home, dusted with a faint background of mildew. But make no mistake, most of the smells are a full-on assault. No filters. No polite airbrushing. Just history, raw and unvarnished, funneled directly into your nostrils. You might laugh, but these sensory reconstructions have taught historians plenty. Smells give context. They remind us that life in 18th century Paris wasn't just seen, it was lived, breathed, endured. The towering elegance of Notre Dame, the glittering salons of the aristocracy, none of it existed in a vacuum of sanitized air. Modern scientists use techniques like headspace analysis, capturing and studying the volatile compounds that create a scent, to approximate these long-lost odors. They combine chemistry with literary accounts, paintings, and even old soap recipes. It's part science, part guesswork, and part dark art. Of course, not everyone agrees on the value of such research. Historians still debate whether recreating the past's worst smells really enhances our understanding or simply punishes our curiosity. Some argue it's a valuable, visceral connection to history. Others suggest it's more like historical tourism for the very brave, or the very foolish. There's even a niche market for historical perfumes, recreations of 18th century scents for those who want to smell like a duchess or a boulevardier, or at least like what they thought they smelled like back then. Spoiler, even the perfumes were heavier, muskier, far more intense than the crisp colognes and airy florals we favor today. You pause and take a breath, tentative, cautious, grateful that modern Paris, with its sewage systems and public hygiene, smells nothing like the nightmare tapestry you've just wandered through. Still, as you think back on your journey, part of you appreciates what those old Parisians endured. Smell maps, vinegar scrubs, clove-studded oranges, they made a life in a city that challenged every sense daily. They survived. They adapted. And, in their way, they turned a reeking, rotting metropolis into the city of light. You step back into the night, the cool, relatively fresh air a small miracle. The Seine glitters nearby, no longer a miasma monster but a river that hums quietly under the modern city's lights. All that's left is to take one final breath, to close your eyes, and to remember that history isn't always grand or clean or sweet-smelling. Sometimes, it stinks. And sometimes, it's worth remembering exactly how. The city settles around you, a muted symphony of distant footsteps, soft murmurs, and the occasional clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones. Your journey through the aromatic labyrinth of 18th-century Paris has brought you face to face with the city's hidden, often unpleasant, character, a city alive not only in its art and politics but in its smells. You reflect on the layers you've passed through, the pungent markets, the desperate perfume battles, the fetid Seine, the noxious tanneries, and the musty, decaying buildings that bore silent witness to centuries of human life. The public latrines, the rich mansions with their feeble attempts at masking the inevitable, the gardens offering fleeting sweetness amid the stench, all woven into a complex olfactory map that told a story as much as any written record. Historians continue to debate the true nature of Paris's smellscape. Was it truly as unbearable as many suggest, or was it merely the normal, unvarnished reality of pre-modern urban life? Did people develop noses of steel, or simply resign themselves to the omnipresent funk? How much did the smells influence daily life, social hierarchies, even political movements? You realize that scent was not just background noise but a vital part of the city's identity, an invisible thread connecting its people, shaping their experiences in subtle and profound ways. And yet, even as the stench pressed in, the city thrived. Life pulsed in its streets. Art blossomed, ideas flourished, revolutions brewed. Paris was a city of contradictions, beautiful and ugly, elegant and raw, fragrant and foul. Now, as you stand here in the present, the memories of those smells linger faintly, not in the air around you but in the recesses of your mind. The faint tang of vinegar, the sweet promise of lavender, the sharp bite of leather, all woven into a tapestry of experience. Take a slow, deep breath now. Let the modern air fill your lungs. The city has changed, and so have you. The olfactory battle may be over, but the story remains, whispered on the wind and in the stones beneath your feet. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a Paris you've never smelled before, a city where history was written not just with ink but with scent. Rest easy now. Let the gentle hum of the night soothe you, and may your dreams be fragrant with sweeter things. The day has faded, and the city's smells, once so overpowering, have softened to a distant murmur. Imagine yourself settling into a cozy room, curtains drawn, a gentle breeze teasing the edges of a window just barely ajar. Outside, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft drip of water, the subtle, comforting scent of wood smoke drifting on cool air. Breathe in slowly. Let the memory of the city's sharpness fade, replaced by the softness of twilight, the calm of night. The odors of history settle like dust on forgotten shelves, gentle now, almost kind. The smells you encountered weren't just unpleasant, they were the breath of a living, breathing city, alive with the hum of human lives, hopes, struggles, and dreams. In their way, they remind us how far we've come, and how much remains beneath the surface. So, rest now. Let the night cradle you. Imagine Paris at peace, its streets washed clean, its air sweet with promise. Good night, and sweet dreams.